Hello everyone, salam alaikum. Today I wanna explain the really powerful and useful tool, the two-dimensional arrays. And why is it useful? Because first of all, it's train your logical thinking, the math, and some concept of data science, like the storing the big amount of data. So I hope this will be the interesting video. And actually, before we start, I want to apologize for such a big break. I had to configure my webcam, and now I hope the quality of videos will be a little bit better. So let's start. Before we move to two-dimensional array, let's just set up our thinking by refreshing our knowledge about the simple array. So let me just define the array of string variables. So we're saying string, square brackets, items, assign it with the new string, and between the second square brackets we have to specify the length, so the length of 3, and let's assign it with some data. So I'm accessing the first item of our array by at index 0, because in programming all indexes start from 0, not from 1. So let's assign it with milk, bread, and now we have filled our items with a length of 3 with the 3 variables and the string data. And let's just confirm we have implemented it fine with the printing it to console using the for each loop. So let's say string item items. If you haven't seen my previous video, this is the syntax for each loop, which is going through the data structure, in our case through the array, and access every item, every variable in this array. So let's just print, we have to print just the item. And here we go. And when I say about the setup of our thinking way, I mean that we have to think about the array, the simple array, as about the list. So let's just imagine that this is the items we want to buy in the market. So we just took the piece of paper right there, items, and just specified the items we want to buy. So milk, bread, and the chocolate. And this is actually the way you should think about the simple array. And how's about two-dimensional array? What is this? So first of all, let me just delete the printing logic, and I'll show you the definition first, and then we'll explain. So we're using the string data type, square brackets, and here we're using again square brackets, give it some name, and assign with the new string and the 2 times square brackets, which we have to also fill with the lengths. So let's make it just 3 and 3. So this construction actually defines the two-dimensional array. And what is different between the simple array and the two-dimensional array? The simple array contains variables, while the two-dimensional array contains arrays. I know it can sound insane, and this is totally fine, and I'll try to explain you a little bit another way. So to understand what actually two-dimensional array is and how does it work, you can think about this as about the table. So the first square brackets will be the rows and the second will be the columns, or actually we can swipe them, but let's just say this way. And to make it more easy, let me just rewrite this part of comment. And our simple array, this is the list, but list just with only one row, which we named items. So if we look at the items array in the context of two-dimensional array, it will be not items, but it will be 0. So the first row will contain the 0, 1, and the 2, or 1, 2, 3 variables. And here this 0 will be placed in the will represent the first square brackets, and the columns will be represented by the second square brackets. Now let me just rewrite this part to make it more readable, so we will put it a little bit down. So we can think about the two-dimensional array as about the table with the rows and the columns. And now let's try to play with this array and fill it with some data, but first I have to conjure some data. Just let me in a moment.
Ri, bri, bicus, dicus, debicus, dedicus.
Thank you for patience. I conjured some data, and now you can see that we have 3 arrays with the variables we wanna assign into our card two-dimensional array. And to do this, we will use already known for loop, and let's just define it. For as a condition, we will use I less than card length, which indicates the length of the first dimension, so the first square brackets. And maybe you can remember from previous lessons that we used a length on the strings, and it was length with the parentheses, but in the case of array we using it without parentheses. And then let's increment our I. And with this loop we are going to access the, as I said before, first dimension, so the rows of our array, and we need something to actually access the columns. And how we can do this? Let's meet something we call inner loop. So we have to define another loop inside already existing. So let's make it also J, and as condition we will do the J less than card square brackets 0 and the length, and also increment our J. So again, this loop we call in outer loop, and the loop inside the loop also called inner loop. Yeah, and why do we actually access in here the first variable of our array? We do this because we wanna actually the length of our row, and this is doesn't matter if we access it in the index 1 or 2 or 3, because as we thinking about array as about the table, and the table must be consistent, so it can't has, for example, the row 0 can't has just the 4th column and the 5th column, or have just one column. All the rows must have the same count of columns, and all the columns has the same count of rows. I know it can look crazy after our very simple lessons, but there is nothing you don't know. So we using the arrays, we using the for loop, and actually the two-dimensional array also described, so you can understand for now how does it work. And here this is just another loop inside already existing loop. So let's again look at this, how will this iterate over our array. So the first for loop will iterate over the first dimension or rows. The second for loop will iterate over the second dimension, so over the columns. And let's just pretty much fill it with the data. To do this, we will use the if-else statement to actually work with the every of arrays we have defined, and we wanna every array represent one row in our two-dimensional array. So we have to write the if, then I equals 0, which will indicate that we are working with the row 0. And then we will write card, access the row at the index of I, and the column at the index of j, and assign it with the items j. If our I is not 0 but 1, it means that we're working with the row number 2 in our array, and we want to fill it with those data which is in the array items 2. So we'll write else if I equals 1, then the same, but assign it with the items 2. And finally, if our I is not 0 and not 1, we can make it just by else, or let's better do it also else if I equals 2, then the same card with the dimension 1 at index I, which is 2, and the row number 3, and with the j, which will be incremented all the time in the inner loop, and assign it with the items 3j. And here we go, we have our two-dimensional array card filled with the data. If you wondering what is going on here, it's totally fine, because this topic is a bit more complicated than previous ones, and let's just review it again together. So we have the two-dimensional array which represent the table, and we have the simple arrays, each of those represent the rows. So one items is a row with the 3 variables, and we fill in our table with those rows and columns and with the data from our arrays. To do this, we using the outer loop, which we have learned today, and the inner loop. The first outer loop do iterate over the length of the first dimension or the rows, and we achieving this by checking the if I is less than card length, which length access the first dimension, and while the I is less than the first dimension length, which is 3, our for loop, outer for loop, will iterate again and again. And inside this iteration, we call in the inner loop. And this loop checks if the j is less than the length of the row. And until the length of the row is bigger than j, it iterates again and again. And inside the loop, we check in the value of our I, and on the result of this, we actually assign in the row, actually columns of the row with the values from corresponding array. So we check in 0, 1 and 2, which is indicated that is always true, so we can just take it out of the LC, but let's keep it here for readability. And when our conditions checked and the variable assigned, we finish an iteration and incrementing j and starting u. And after the finishing the inner loop, we incrementing I. And to verify if it works, let's traditionally print it. And to print the values, we will also use the for loop, and we will condition we will make will be I less than card length and the I plus plus, and we will use another loop, the same, to access the row lengths. And here let's print just row, and we will use the I and column, and we will access the variable at the card with the row at index I and the column at index j. And let's print it. And as you can see, we have the milk, bread and the chocolate at the first row or 0 index row. Then we have the coffee, tea and the cacao at the row number 1, and row number 2 has the values from the last array. And that's it about the two-dimensional arrays. Hope you understood it, and recommend you to play with the two-dimensional arrays. You can also try with the integers, it will be a bit easier. And don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to my channel to see more content, and see you in the next lesson.